Welcome to the pilot's preliminary briefing for the tutorial series, The Art of the Mirage F1. We will go over a brief synopsis of the module, various settings and options you should consider before flying, a brief cockpit orientation, and recommended HOTAS controls to get the most out of the Mirage F1. Hello fellow virtual aviators and welcome to our new tutorial series, The Art of the Mirage F1. Yes, we are going back to the 1970s, a time of flared trousers, the Atari 2600 and disco. It was also a time of great unrest in the world. Despite détente, it was the height of the Cold War between the West and the Soviets. The Arab-Israeli conflict continued to rage. Oil and energy crises loomed, diplomatic relations between the USA and the People's Republic of China were restored, and the Pahlavi dynasty were ousted during the Iranian Revolution. In the midst of all this, a new fighter aircraft, developed in the late 60s and put into production in the early 70s, was proving its worth, the Mirage F1, which in my opinion is a great addition to DCS world. Because we are stepping back in time somewhat compared to the most popular airframes available in DCS, with the 1970s technology we are going to encounter some different trials compared with, say, the Mirage 2000C or the F-16 Viper. However, I hope this tutorial series will be of some use to you and you will take up the challenge of becoming a Mirage F1 pilot. Today we won't be doing any flying, but we will be going through a short introduction to help you prepare for our tutorial curriculum. So notepads at the ready as we go through our pilot's preliminary briefing. In this briefing, we will be going over some information that is useful knowledge before flying the Mirage F1 in DCS world. The Mirage F1 was manufactured by Dassault Aviation, developed and originally flown in the late 1960s, but introduced in 1973, in the middle of the Cold War. It originated in a French Air Force specification for an all-weather interceptor, a post-war term for an aircraft able to operate in IFR and night conditions. Not only did it serve with the French Air Force as a replacement for their Mirage 3s and 5s, it also served with the Spanish Air Force and the Hellenic Air Force, amongst others. In terms of its development, it is considered to be a third-generation fighter. The module in DCS World has been produced by Aegis, a Spanish developer. Consequently, the Mirage F1's modelling primarily follows that used by the Spanish Air Force. At the present time, the module consists of two variants, the CE and the EE, which are the Spanish export versions of the French C and E variants respectively. Aegis have also promised to develop the BE and M variants. The Mirage F1 CE is Spain's version of the original production F1C Interceptor. Its main characteristics are its Cyrano 4 radar, its reliance on gyromagnetic and radio navigation, and its basic infrared and semi-active radar-guided weaponry. The Mirage F1 EE is the Spanish version of the F1E, which was a multi-role fighter. More advanced than the CE, the F1EE has an upgraded Cyrano 4M radar, the introduction of an inertial navigation system, improved options for electronic warfare, and in-flight refueling capability. The planned future configurations to be included with the module are the two-seat trainer version, the F1BE, and the F1M, which is an upgraded version of the F1EE with 1990s technology. Under the Special tab in the DCS World Options, we have a number of settings for the Mirage F1. I recommend applying the simplified gear lever and simplified firing safety logic options if your HOTAS buttons are limited. If you have a throttle with a detent, You will need to experiment with this setting here to tune where the detent will be on the virtual throttle apparatus. Fuel and countermeasure counters are normally set manually in the Mirage F1 cockpit. Select this option to have them automatically update when you refuel or rearm. The fuel counter has a distinctive ticking sound in the cockpit which may not be to everyone's taste. This can be reduced by selecting this option. The Cyrano radar's display screen is normally equipped with a hood to reduce glare. It can be removed by default with this option. The following settings adjust various characteristics of the flight stick which are present in the real aircraft. I have left these set to their defaults. These settings adjust how voice messages from the F1EE's radar warning receiver are presented. In the mission editor, a player or client-based Mirage F1 has the following options, most importantly the countermeasure program, gun and rocket burst and salvo settings, and the laser code for GBUs. Please note that at the present time, these can only be adjusted in the mission editor and not in the cockpit. Okay, so we're sitting in the cockpit of our Mirage F1 CE, and the layout is fairly typical of a fighter aircraft. Most of my instruments are placed on the front dash or around its periphery, and the majority of my system controls are placed on the left and right consoles, the left, center and right vertical panels, and the left and right walls. We have a right-hand stick for pitch and roll, which is placed centrally between our legs, and a left-hand throttle on the console for thrust. Yaw control is by rudder pedals, as you can see. Another important control is the radar control stick on the left console, a feature of many third-generation fighters before HOTAS radar control. In terms of visibility, it scores a cool 7 out of 10. Flanks, above and rear quadrant are very clear, but forward is more limited due to the bow and struts. We are now going to take a quick guided tour of the various panels and gauges to help you familiarise yourself with the cockpit layout, starting with the Mirage F1 CE. Primary barometric altimeter. Backup barometric altimeter. Airspeed and Mach indicator. Vertical speed indicator. Spherical attitude direction indicator. Navigation indicator. Backup attitude indicator. Engine RPM indicator. Afterburner indicator lights. Jet pipe temperature indicator. Fuel gauges, indicators and controls. Shock cone position indicator. Master alarm and caution light. Fire warning light. Various system indicator lights. Slats, flaps, gear and brake configuration indicator lights. Selective jettison controls. Sight symbology controls. Autopilot controls. Radar scope. Radar warning receiver. Sight head. Sight camera. Clock. Backup magnetic compass. Countermeasure controls. Angle of attack indicator. Accelerometer. Jammer detection and dogfight lights. Sight depression controls. Canopy hinge strut. Parking brake. Landing gear controls. Emergency regulation controls. Flight control system controls. Countermeasure release button. C plus M or SW are deselection switch. Telemeter zone scanning switch. Brake chute lever. canopy embrittlement lever, landing light control, V/UHF green radio panel, engine ignition panel, master arm switch, sound configuration panel, high lift device selector switch, throttle, throttle cut and idle switch, in-flight relight button, combat flaps controls on throttle, air brake controls on throttle, radar control stick and associated controls, UHF red radio panel, flight control test panel, emergency engine regulation controls, slat and flap lever, rudder trim switch, oxygen system controls, emergency landing gear handle, electrical system control panel, warning light panel, navigation light switch, formation light switch, canopy lock lever, system power switches, armaments control panel, radar scope control panel, radar power control switches, navigation reference system control panel, TACAN panel, VOR ILS panel, omnibearing control, heading selection knob, pilot oxygen indicator panel, cockpit environmental control panel, interior lighting control panel, circuit breaker box, anti-skid system switch, shock cone manual control switches, fuel transfer switch, hydraulic pressure selector switch, hydraulic pressure gauge, nose wheel steering controls, IFF transponder, cabin altimeter, trim indicator, seat height adjustment switch, ejector seat safety pin. The Mirage F1 EE is not too dissimilar from the CE variant, but you will find that some gauges and panels have moved or have been rearranged. The position of the following components on the front dash have significantly changed. The primary altimeter and airspeed indicator have now swapped places. The shock cone position indicator and the vertical speed indicator have also swapped places. The flap, slats, gear and brake configuration panel is now here. The original radar warning receiver has been removed, being replaced with the radar scope control panel from the right console. A new RWR and its associated controls have been installed here. On the left console, the UHF red radio panel has been moved next to the V/UHF green radio panel. Most of the engine ignition controls have been moved to the rear, and the other engine safety controls have been consolidated around the throttle, together with the anti-skid system switch. The interior lighting panel is now on the left console, having moved from the right console. The most significant change on the right console is the installation of an INS system, whose panel is here. The remaining panels are generally the same, but have been rearranged to fit the new navigation computer. On the centre vertical panel, the nose wheel steering controls and the manual controls for the shock cones have moved further down. There are a number of other minor differences with the Mirage F1 EE, but they shouldn't get in the way of our tutorial curriculum. I have always been reluctant to provide tutorials on key bindings, as I feel each pilot should develop a system that works for them. As you may know, I'm not a hardcore milsim-er, although I occasionally enjoy that sort of thing. Primarily, I just like to enjoy DCS World. To help digest the HOTAS controls of the Mirage F1, I have divided them up into actual HOTAS controls, suggested HOTAS controls, and optional HOTAS or panel controls, which will make things a little bit easier. I will then share my preferred setup on my own HOTAS. The actual HOTAS controls are essential. As the module is still in early access, some of the terminology may change, but when you are assigning buttons in the controls menu, look out for these functions. Gun button is the term used for the trigger to fire the cannons. Trim controls are definitely required, and you will need 4 buttons for nose up, nose down, left wing down, and right wing down. Bombs, rockets, missiles, and sight recorder button is used to release ordnance. The autopilot disconnect trigger temporarily removes autopilot authority, and the autopilot disengage lever switches it off completely. The microphone button is your push to talk, which is best employed within the SRS standalone radio software. Combat flaps are deployed for maneuverability and require 2 buttons to extend and retract them, labelled lever and button. The unwieldy name C plus M or SW R button places the Mirage F1 into a dogfight-like mode. C plus M or SW stands for cannons and magic or sidewinders. Another unwieldy name is the Cannon 300 to 600 meter and missile lock-unlock button. Think of this as similar to the cage-uncage button found on other airframes. And finally, the essential air brake controls, for which you will need 2 positions. Suggested HOTAS controls, in my mind, will make flying the Mirage F1 much more user-friendly. However, in reality, these controls are not on the stick or throttle. I like to have my autopilot controls handy, and you will need 5 buttons if you wish to apply them to the HOTAS. Nosewheel steering high sensitivity button is actually on the center vertical panel, but other airframes commonly have a control similar to this on the stick. The radar control stick changes the parameters on the radar scope, as well as the position of the alidade or target designator. These are very handy to have HOTAS bound rather than using a separate control stick as in the actual aircraft. Strangely, whilst the C plus M or SWR selector switch is on the throttle in the real Mirage F1, the switch to turn it off is not. I find it handy to have it close by. A zoom view is essential in DCS World, and I prefer to bind this to a HOTAS axis. The countermeasures release button is on the left wall. Most modern airframes have this on the HOTAS somewhere, and I have gotten used to it being there. Wheel brakes are bound to the toe levers on my rubber pedals. The optional controls could just as well be bound to keys on the keyboard, but I have these bound to HOTAS controls or panel switches where possible. Another thing to consider is that you will need to bind controls separately for the Mirage F1 CE and the Mirage F1 EE. Let's now take a look at my own preferred setup. Now, I use a Winwing Orion 2 HOTAS with the F16 style controls, so my setup ends up being a bastardization of the F16 style and Mirage 2000C setup. I know what I like, people. So you may find this layout abhorrent. Nevertheless, this is what I use, and perhaps it will be helpful to you in developing your own layout. So for the gun button, I obviously use the trigger. If you are not using the simplified firing safety logic from the options, you will need to also bind the gun button safety cover. Trim controls, as standard, go on the trim hat in the 4 directions. For the bombs, rockets, missiles and sight recorder button, I use this button on the front of the stick. For the autopilot disconnect trigger, I use this paddle here. For the autopilot disengage lever, I use the push function on the trim hat. The microphone button is bound outside of DCS for SRS use, and I use this instantaneous switch here, backwards and forwards for the two radios. For the combat flap lever and button, I am using the extension trigger, forward for the lever and return to its original position for the button. The C+M or SWR switch is my dogfight switch, so I am using the dogfight switch here on the F-16's throttle grip, forwards for select and returns to the center position for deselect. The Cannon 300 to 600 meter and missile lock and lock button is akin to cage and uncage, so I use the press function of this hat here. The air brake controls are obviously bound to the F-16's air brake switch here, aft for extend and forward for retract. Moving on to the suggested controls, autopilot controls I prefer to have on this hat switch here on the side of the stick. I'm not sure why, I'm just used to it being there. I have the autopilot PA switch bound to the push function, and then the Alt, Cap, G and R switches bound to the 4 directions. Nose wheel steering high sensitivity button is bound to this button here, which is a common position for NWS control in other airframes. The telemeter zone scanning switch is akin to an ACM or close combat radar mode switch, so I place the 3 options here on this hat: forward for TEL, right for center, and aft for BPZ. For the zoom view, I use this wheel here. The chaff flares release button I have bound to this hat here, as well as this panic button on the throttle. Other countermeasure switches are bound to the directions of this hat. As for the radar controls, I toyed with the idea of plugging in a second joystick to represent the radar control stick, but decided to try and fit the important commands on my main HOTAS. The radar controls are quite complicated, so on the throttle I use the 4 directional switches on this hat, forward and aft for scale selection control, and left and right for scan selection control. For the bearing control and the range stroke velocity controls, which move the alidade or target designator, I use this stick here with its push function bound to the lock-on. Elevation controls are bound to this wheel here. On the stick, I have the radar control stick unlocking control bound to the push function of this hat. The TWS function is bound to the push function of this hat. As for the optional HOTAS or panel controls, I have most of these on the throttle base of the Winwing Orion 2. The Armament Master Switch, Arm, Safe and Test functions are bound to the 3 positions of this switch here. The brake shoot, deploy and release controls are bound to this switch here labelled Hook. The parking brake handle is bound to the brake switch here. The heading and omni-bearing controls are bound to the rotary encoders here labelled heading and course. Landing gear controls are bound to the gear switch using the simplified gear lever from the options. And I would normally use this button for a master failure warning light, but in the EE variant this is 2 separate buttons, so I have used these 2 for caution and warning. As my autopilot controls are on my stick, I use this switch for my radar selector. It's 3 positions bound to off, standby and emit. For the seat height control, I use this lever. The 3 positions of the slat flap lever are bound to this 3 position switch here. And finally, the throttle cut stroke idle switch is bound to this button here, although I may move this to the throttle idle detent button hidden in the lever of the Winwing Orion 2. Well, as ever, I hope that was useful for you and that you are looking forward to learning the art of the Mirage F1. With heartfelt gratitude to my patrons, Jan11 and Lakota21, your support will always be thankfully received and faithfully applied. Feel free to do the usual thing, like, subscribe, comment and share, but until next time, virtual aviators, I look forward to seeing you online in the skies. This is Reiver saying last call.